On the night of July 24, 1943, a Messerschmitt Bf-110 night fighter, piloted by Oberleutnant Heinrich Prinz to Sein Wittgenstein, intercepted an RAF Lancaster bomber over Hamburg at precisely 18,000 feet using standard Liechtenstein BC radar with a detection range of 4 kilometers. 30 minutes later, British bombers began dropping strips of aluminum foil cut to precise wavelengths of 67 centimeters, and Wittgenstein's radar screen dissolved into a blizzard of false contacts that rendered his equipment completely useless. He landed at Stade Airfield at 0247 hours, having expended 0 ammunition after achieving 0 intercepts following that first kill, describing his radar display as showing 1,000 aircraft where only dozens existed. RAF Bomber Command lost only 12 aircraft that night from a force of 791 bombers, striking Germany's second-largest city, a loss rate of 1.5% when Luftwaffe night fighter doctrine predicted sustainable attrition approaching 6% per raid. The strips of aluminum foil weighed precisely 0.87 grams each. British scientists called them window. German radar operators called them catastrophe. Luftwaffe High Command had dismissed radar countermeasures as propaganda fantasies for 18 months before Window's deployment, and that institutional denial cost Germany its only effective defense against strategic bombing at exactly the moment when industrial targets could still be protected through air superiority. The Luftwaffe's relationship with radar technology began with confidence that bordered on arrogance. German scientists developed Würzburg ground control radar sets by 1940, achieving target detection ranges of 40 kilometers with angular accuracy sufficient to vector night fighters onto bomber streams within 500 meters of intercept position. The Liechtenstein Airborne Intercept Radar entered squadron service in August 1941, fitting into Bf-110 and Ju-88 night fighters with antenna arrays that added 200 kilograms to aircraft weight but enabled detection of heavy bombers from 4,000 meters in darkness. These systems worked. RAF bomber losses climbed from 3.2% of sorties in early 1942 to 5.4% by March 1943, rates that threatened to render strategic bombing economically unsustainable. A Lancaster cost £42,000 sterling to manufacture and required 7 crew members who had each consumed over 300 training hours before operational deployment. Lose 1 bomber per mission and the arithmetic remained acceptable. Lose 2 per squadron per raid, and replacement rates couldn't match attrition. German night fighter doctrine optimized around this calculus, prioritizing reliable intercepts over spectacular kill counts, and the doctrine succeeded through radar-guided precision that rendered darkness irrelevant as defensive cover. British intelligence identified German radar capabilities by February 1942 through signals intercepts and reconnaissance photographs showing Würzburg installations along the French coast. The telecommunications research establishment at Malvern immediately began developing countermeasures, settling on metallized paper strips as the simplest solution. Flood German radar frequencies with false returns by scattering millions of dipole reflectors from bomber formations. The physics proved trivial, implementation faced bureaucratic paralysis. Winston Churchill's scientific advisor, Professor Frederick Lindemann, calculated that deploying Window over Germany would inevitably teach Luftwaffe scientists the technique, enabling them to deploy identical countermeasures against British coastal radar chains during potential invasion operations. We hand them a defensive solution that they can immediately weaponize against our early warning systems, Lindemann argued in cabinet meetings throughout early 1943. The tactical gain of reducing bomber losses must be weighed against the strategic risk of compromising our air defense integrity. The debate consumed 14 months, while RAF bomber crews died at rates approaching 44% per 30-mission tour, losses that crews could calculate with grim precision during pre-flight briefings where they counted empty beds in their barracks and understood that statistical survival required improbable luck sustained across months of operations. Luftwaffe intelligence possessed complete information about Window's potential by November 1942 after recovering intact British technical documents from a crashed Wellington bomber. The files described metallized strips, specified dimensions, explained deployment procedures, and estimated effectiveness against Würzburg and Liechtenstein systems. German radar engineers confirmed the threat through laboratory testing, demonstrating that properly tuned dipoles could generate returns indistinguishable from aircraft on existing equipment.
They reported findings up command channels, where staff officers dismissed the intelligence as British deception. The enemy wishes us to waste resources developing countermeasures for a fictional capability, noted an assessment from Luftwaffe 3 headquarters, dated January 1943. No evidence suggests actual deployment. We interpret these documents as psychological warfare intended to degrade our confidence in proven systems. The reasoning possessed superficial logic. If Window worked as described, RAF would have deployed it already given their unsustainable loss rates. That they hadn't proved it couldn't work, or so the argument concluded. The flaw in this analysis stemmed from mirror imaging, projecting German ruthless tactical pragmatism onto British strategic caution, and failing to imagine that operational doctrine might prioritize long-term defensive integrity over immediate offensive gains. German officers couldn't conceive that an enemy would accept thousands of aircrew deaths to protect a theoretical future vulnerability, so they interpreted restraint as evidence of impossibility rather than strategic discipline.
The night of July 24, 1943, shattered these comfortable assumptions with industrial efficiency. RAF bombers dropped 92 million window strips over Hamburg in 93 minutes, generating radar returns equivalent to 20,000 aircraft on German ground control displays. Würzburg operators reported their screens white with snow, unable to distinguish individual contacts or vector night fighters onto actual bomber formations. Luftwaffe pilots flying blind through searchlight beams spotted enemy aircraft visually at ranges under 300 meters, too close for effective intercepts against formations traveling at 280 kilometers per hour. I saw bombers passing overhead, close enough to identify their markings, but my radar showed nothing usable, wrote Major Werner Streib, Commodore of Nachtjagdgeschwader 1, in his combat report from that operation. We reverted to tactics we had abandoned 2 years earlier, hunting by sight alone, and the results proved catastrophic. German night fighters claimed 17 kills from visual contact that night, approximately 1/10 their normal effectiveness. Hamburg burned. Over 40,000 civilians died in the firestorm that developed during subsequent raids when window deployment continued and German defenses remained paralyzed. The city's industrial capacity declined by 75%. Albert Speer later testified that 6 similar attacks on other cities would have forced German surrender through industrial collapse alone, though RAF Bomber Command never achieved concentration sufficient to replicate Hamburg's destruction before German countermeasures restored defensive capability. Luftwaffe response came within 6 weeks through tactical adaptation rather than technological breakthrough. Engineers couldn't eliminate Window's effectiveness, but they could reduce its impact through doctrinal changes and equipment modifications. Ground controllers switched to running commentaries, describing bomber stream locations based on acoustic sensors, visual sightings, and damage reports, rather than precise radar vectors. Pilots received training in autonomous hunting patterns, learning to position themselves beneath bomber formations and spot engine exhausts against cloud layers without radar guidance. Nachtjagdgeschwader 1 developed wild boar tactics, where single-seat fighters operated independently in target areas, sacrificing the precision intercepts that radar enabled, but regaining some capability to inflict losses. New Liechtenstein SN2 radar sets, operating on longer wavelengths, entered production, reaching operational squadrons by March 1944, with performance Window couldn't jam effectively. These adaptations partially restored German night fighter effectiveness by autumn 1943, pushing RAF bomber losses back toward 4% per mission, but the 4-month window of German defensive paralysis allowed Bomber Command to strike targets that later became unreachable once countermeasures matured. The Hamburg firestorm represented what systematic strategic bombing could achieve when defenses collapsed, and it proved impossible to replicate once Germany adapted, leaving historians to debate whether earlier window deployment might have shortened the war by months through sustained industrial destruction during the critical summer of 1943. What makes this episode instructive beyond its tactical and operational dimensions is how institutional overconfidence transformed accurate intelligence into strategic blindness. Luftwaffe officers possessed every technical detail necessary to understand Window's threat 18 months before its deployment. They chose disbelief over preparation because the implied vulnerability seemed too severe to accept and because their enemy's behavioral pattern fit no rationalization they could imagine. The cost of that denial measured in thousands of civilian deaths, strategic bombing effectiveness that couldn't be contained, and defensive paralysis during the precise months when German industrial capacity remained vulnerable to concentrated attack.
In the end, the war's outcome flowed partly from German failure to imagine that an enemy might accept short-term losses to preserve long-term advantages, and from the deadlier failure to recognize that sometimes propaganda contains truth, particularly when the truth proves too uncomfortable to acknowledge.